Hello and welcome to this presentation on Russian cyber attacks in Ukraine. Um, I am the presenter, Jacob Goodroe. Let's get started. I think there's not too much of an introduction. Everyone knows who Russia is and Ukraine are and um, what cyber attacks are. So not too much of an introduction, but let's go. All right, so basic overview. 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine again. Not the first time. Original invasion was in 2014. On February 24th, they invaded again. So that kind of has um, a push for cyber attacks before and surrounding the Russian invasion. So just to give an overview, some of the key players on both sides in this kind of cyber war is the Russian Information Operations Troops, uh, blanket term for all Russian cyber sub-organizations. This could be in the military. This could be in um, intelligence sector. Either way, that's kind of the blanket term for it. The recently made Army cyber group for Ukraine is called the IT Army of Ukraine. Recently came out within the past few years, so it's still brand new, but they still are a key player. The U.S. Army Cyber Command. So the reason I specifically put the U.S. Army Cyber Command is because in most of these instances, I guess, in these reports, it's not mentioned who specifically on the US side is doing these. I mean, there's so many different like cybersecurity and intelligence agencies for the United States. I mean, even the reserves, like Coast Guard, has their own cyber sector. So I just put U.S. Army blanket, term. The Air Force has one. The Marines have one. There's a bunch. So I just threw that in there. NATO. So obviously, because we're dealing with essentially NATO and CTSO nations or CSTO, NATO is going to be in there for dealing with these reports as well. And then third-party entities, which I'll point out later on. Um, but you'll notice that there's a lot of third-party entities. So we're going to be talking about the recent cyber attacks within just 2022 alone. I know it's like April, I think. Yeah, it's April. But there's been a decent amount of attacks. Now, the only issue is that there's not too much information that the public can find out about these attacks, nor should we be able to, because it's like we're talking intergovernment cyber warfare, so it's understandable that we're not going to have too much information on these cyber attacks right now because they're still current threats. But the main bulk of it is going to be analyzing previous cyber attacks and how they relate into the current cyber attacks. I just kind of put up a list here of the software that's involved. Most of these are for previous attacks, and you'll notice how you can kind of see a pattern between the previous attacks and the current ones. Um, I just put the list up there. I originally was going to just explain what they all are, but that's going to be too long. Um, it's just, I'll explain it as each attack happens. So let's go on to the next one. So, cyber attack overview. If you notice, they've all happened fairly recently. I have them date by date because different stages of attacks coincide with dates of the invasion. And I think that's the most important thing is if you notice that there's a lot of attacks before the invasion and then like a few after, and you could tell that there's like differences, whereas the earlier ones, January, early February, those are more institutional attacks, whereas the later ones are more personal individual attacks. Again, so far as the information we can get, we just have kind of blanket information. The previous cyber attacks are more full-scale operations with intelligence reports and they in full-on investigations. Those ones are where you're going to see most of the exploits. You're going to see most of the malware, ransomware, what have you, in this presentation. All right, so let's start with the more recent one because that's what everyone kind of wants to know. So, um, let's see here. Whispergate. All right. So, so on January 13th, this recent year, um, Whispergate, this malware, was detected by the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center inside the Ukrainian government and private sector systems. So one of the more serious systems that were infected was the state emergency service in Ukraine, and it makes sense why that would be a target. Um, so Whispergate. Whispergate is a malware spinoff of just ransomware. That's a very blanket term, I guess, in this case. It uses malware tactics, right? Or ransomware tactics to, instead of like, encrypting someone's data and asking for a ransom, what it simply does is it says, I'm going to encrypt your data and then delete it. Now, anybody could delete data, but what this one, so far as I understand, is that it encrypts it and deletes some of it and encrypts it further. So that way, when you decrypt it, you cannot tell what the information was before. So again, because you can't really delete information fully. Um, so specifically though, what it would do is it would overwrite the master boot record. So if you don't know what a master boot record is, at the beginning of like, a hard drive, it tells you it's just that early information that tells you how to partition the hard drive and to load the operating system itself. But it overwrote that with a note, normally a ransom note. So what it did then was it downloaded another section of the malware after rewriting that. It would then, that malware would fill all the target files in a list, like a specific list targeting certain files. Again, this is very vague information. It's not information that we're allowed to have. And then deletes it. Again, it was very vague. The report was vague. I wish it wasn't. Um, but it supposedly was very precise in the files that it was deleting. Uh, so I don't know the broader implications of that. Again, this is all very vague information for the recent one. So on January 14th, a Russian cyber attack on about 70 Ukrainian government websites took place. Now, the entire text and everything on the websites were erased, and all that was left was a simple string, a text string that said, "Be afraid and wait for the worst." This was followed by allegations on other websites that the information, sensitive government information, was then leaked to the internet. Um, and then, the site shut down eventually. Ukrainian intelligence agencies shut down the sites and then investigated the attack. Um, while they ended up bringing the sites back up a few hours later. So they ended up narrowing the breach specifically to a private company, unnamed software company that supposedly developed either software that's relating to the government computers that were used, or relating, I believe, to the websites that they were using. Um, it's very vague with that; it doesn't specifically say. But the attackers had full administrative access to the company, that private company, to perpetuate the attack itself. So they ended up, after the investigation, they determined that it's again, a third party group that they believe has ties to the Belarusian government, called UNC 1151. So that's pretty interesting. I haven't heard anything about them before. I tried to look a bit into them, haven't really found too much information. So I can't tell you who they are. I don't know, other than that they're linked to the Belarusian government. So on January 19th, a Russian APT called Primitive Bear attempted to gain unauthorized access to an undisclosed NATO government entity. Um, Yeah, again, I said that this was going to be vague. They haven't told anybody. They said that it was a NATO government entity. Now, what is an APT? I'm going to bring this up. Technically, the last one is believed to be an APT, the UNC 1151. Um, the same is to be said for uh, primitive bear. Now, what an APT is an advanced persistent threat. So it's defined as a state-sponsored group that gains unauthorized access to computer networks. You're going to see a lot of these. I just run them as third-party entities because that's kind of what they are. But again, they usually have, well, they do by definition have a link to a government. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Although it was unsuccessful, the most important part of this that I learned was that the damage to it could have been severe, mainly because previous attacks by Primitive Bear have been typically followed up by another APT, or specifically a Russian APT called Invisible. Now, what would happen is Primitive Bear would gain access to the network. Again, don't know how. All of this is vague information. And Invisible would supposedly follow up and exploit the system further for whatever state goals that they have. Um, so it could have been a lot worse, but it luckily didn't go anywhere else. So, February 15th. So there was a DDoS attack on the websites of the Ukrainian army, defense ministry, and banking systems. Although that's a very broader term, the larger banks that were attacked were Private Bank, or Private without an E Bank, and Aschad Bank. Again, I'm gonna butcher pronunciation, so please be kind. So the threat was detected by netbooks specifically, but it does occur to me that not many people are gonna know what a DDoS attack is. So what a DDoS attack is that it's a distributed denial of service attack. Basically, a bunch of traffic from multiple sources are funneled into a service or a website to overwhelm it with traffic, uh, create a bottleneck, whatever. So the actual information that's supposed to get there doesn't, and it basically disables anybody from sending stuff to it because it's filled with traffic, disabling the website effectively because nothing can communicate with it. Now, this will be brought up multiple times. DDoS attacks are fairly common. I want to say that they're common, but maybe they're just sometimes a bit more low level, so they're more popular. Whereas, I mean, to be honest, half of these are going to be malware, so maybe they're not that common in general, or at least in this slide. But I always believe that they were fairly common. But so NetBlocks ended up detecting it. Now, what NetBlocks is, it's a watchdog organization that essentially monitors threats on the internet. So they ended up detecting it, and in conjunction with other people, UK and US intelligence suggested that it was perpetuated by uh, the Russian GRU, which is the Russian main intelligence directorate. Now, the funny reason why they came to the conclusion, or at least I think it's funny, is because just before and during the attack, there was a bunch of traffic between the GRU and Ukrainian IP ranges. Um, so I just thought that was funny because it's like, how can we tell that it's not us? Well, let's just increase the amount of traffic that we're going to directly send between us. I just think it's funny, but that's what the analysts end up coming to the conclusion of. But yeah, that was just funny to me. All right, so February 23rd, 2022. So again, we're following up with another DDoS attack. Um, this one attacks specifically the Ukrainian military, government, and banking websites specifically. Um, so after the immediate investigation of the attack, malware, very similar to the Whispergate that we saw before, was found on hundreds of government computers. This malware specifically, I couldn't find a difference between the two, between Whispergate and this one, which is called Hermetic Wiper. Again, these are very new. I don't know. I couldn't find that much information on it. Again, this is they're probably not going to want to release this information, so that's perfectly fine. Um, but it was discovered on it because it was named that because there's a specific code signing certificate signature from a company in Cyprus called Hermetica Digital Limited. The signature specifically was created on December 28th of the previous year. So the assumption is that the attack was planned a few months ago. So it's already had knowledge beforehand to attack at this time or around this time. So the same malware, though, was found earlier in November of 2021 in Lithuania. Um, and again, the difference between the two is a bit different. It's still ransoms data. Instead of ransoming data, it just deletes it. But they seem to still operate using the same tactics. So on March 6th, fairly simple. There were cyber attacks on individual civilians en masse. It wasn't like this huge, crazy, intricate thing. It was just undisclosed or undescribed attacks. Don't know how they attacked, don't know anything like that. But it was more towards people's individual devices like smartphones and personal computers. But instead of like high ranking officials, it was like, I'm going to hack everyone in the city. Again, the public information for this is very limited. But I was thinking more so from a military standpoint. Because after this, the Russians are already in Ukraine. Um, I've seen people on Twitter who like post videos directly. This was an intelligence thing I remember reading on, and it was how Ukrainian civilians would just videotape Russian like patrols or like convoys and stuff, and they'd upload it to places like Twitter, and then that intelligence agencies would end up using that to go, hey, there's a convoy there, let's go airstrike it. It's like that idea that civilians are now being used in this intelligence role is very interesting, very much game changing, especially with new technology. I mean, it's been used before throughout thousands of years, but it's honestly kind of terrifying because now anybody with a cell phone who points at a convoy is now considered a threat if they are like let's say I'm a Russian soldier and I'm going through a town and there's a bunch of civilians pointing phones at me, and I now have the potential risk of being ambushed. What's going to stop me from perceiving them as a threat because they will end up getting me killed 10 minutes later because now I'm going to have a bunch of people shoot at me? Well, what's going to stop me from shooting that guy so that my convoy doesn't get stopped? And that's kind of a bit more scary because it's putting civilians more into that intelligence role. I didn't mean to go too much off topic, but I just thought the broader implications of civilians more so being attacked in these cyber attacks a bit more troubling. But not that the rest of this isn't troubling. So March 9th. So on March 9th, I thought this was really cool. Quad 9, which is an anti-malware software from Switzerland, ended up blocking 4.6 million separate malware attacks against these individual devices. Again, just as before, these aren't high-level officials. These are just anybody who has internet access within this IP range. Like that's all it was. Just malware attacks against a bunch of people. Ended up hitting Poland and Ukraine the most, though. Well, Ukraine more so than Poland. I think there was a few cases where it hit Germany as well. Um, but yeah, I just thought that was really interesting. Now, specifically, what um, Quad 9 is that it's a recursive DNS resolver. Stops malware and phishing attempts. So this one I thought was really neat, especially since I'm learning about BGP or have learned about BGP, I guess. Was at rtcom.ru, which is the Russian or one of the Russian ISPs. ended up attacking Twitter for 2 hours and 15 minutes. So what they did was they hijacked the BGP prefix, which is the autonomous system number 13414, uh, through the internet. So if you don't know what BGP is, it's kind of like the protocol of the internet. So what they did was they ended up hijacking the prefix itself for the administrative system, autonomous system. Sorry. Um, so what they did was they basically blocked all access to Twitter. Um, if you want to look at more into that, that one's really funny. There wasn't too much information on it, but I just thought it was really funny. All right, so okay, so turning back the clocks a little bit, we're going to be looking at previous cyber attacks. This one in particular is one of the earlier ones that still pertain to Ukraine, somewhat in the present day. This is Operation Armageddon. This, again, is a Russian operation against Ukraine. Um, so the entire point of this attack, specifically, like all the other ones, are targeting Ukrainian systems. The SBU determined that Russian intelligence agencies were targeting specifically the military, law enforcement, and government officials of Ukraine. The classification was of a spearfishing attack specifically. Now, the difference between spearfishing and fishing, if you didn't know, was that fishing, for example, is like I'm gonna go cast my net and see if anybody will click on my link, basically. Where spearfishing is I am going to look at a specific targeted individual. So I guess I should reel back the scope because I don't know if anybody even knows what fishing is. So what fishing is it is specifically a social engineering attempt on a wide range of individuals um, in order to gain access to their devices. So, spearfishing in particular is a methodical social engineering attempt on specific targeted individuals to compromise a system or network. So, for example, let's say if I wanted to get into the Ukrainian military, I would have to look at okay, well, if I want to get into this specific network at this base, which are the people that are going to have access to that network? And I look at who they are and where they go, things that they do. Let's say, I don't know, someone likes to fish and like fishing, like actual, cast a net at like real. I guess fishing shouldn't really be a good example, but it's on the mind right now. Um, well, I would send them a link for look at this really cool fishing rod. I think that you might like it. They click it. Now you're onto their individual device. Everything from small little things like that to, which I'll get to later in the operation because I guess I don't want to spoil it. Um, just some clever ways that they would get access and social engineer officials to gain access to their networks. Um, it really is pretty crazy how they did it. Um, but this attack was very successful, allowing the FSB to capture documents and intelligence from key individuals throughout Ukraine. The information was then assimilated into other spear phishing attempts to use sensitive information that's known to only those in the Ukrainian government. So what they do is they would take, let's say, if there's maybe 30 people who know about this thing happening um, in the Ukrainian military, for example, right? They know that some exercise is going to take place. Well, if you could compromise one person's system and gain access to their secretive documents, right, their sensitive information, they would then use that information to then apply on to others like targeted individuals, and they'd send emails, various kind of communications saying like, oh hey, um, remember that document like where we're talking about uh, that training exercise here, where should we go for this? I was talking to some other guy about it, and they like, oh yeah, here's a link for the PDF that I made up for the report. They'd click it and again gain access to that system, and it would propagate and spread. The more information they gather, the better their spear phishing attacks would be. Um, and it spread through the Ukrainian network. Um, it is impressive, but very dangerous. Um, it is honestly scary how quickly it spread. Um, but uh, it spread through the Ukrainian network. So once they were compromised, the malware was then installed on these uh, on these devices. Specifically, um, it would allow an SFX dropper, which is a self-extracting archive, and on these hosts, it would download payloads to the victim computer. These reportedly have been disguised as updates for everyday common programs like Chrome and Adobe Flash Player updates. Um, so there have been specific instances in these updates, and specifically in the malware, that it's been a described as a multi-stage payload, where malware is downloaded in stages to attack certain areas of a victim's system defenses, I guess, without being compromised by intrusion detection or antivirus systems or anything like that. So let's say, this is hypothetical and really shouldn't be how a network works, but let's say makes it through the network firewall, right, or makes it through intrusion detection and makes it through the firewall. It will then be on the computer. Let's say it attacks antivirus, so it doesn't scan it. Let's say it then, once antivirus is compromised and gone, no longer to deal with, then it could be a bit more bold and it can touch more parts of the system files, which means that then it can attack the firewall. And then once the firewall is compromised and it ignores the movements and actions of this malware, then it downloads the third payload, which might take out the IDS or IPS or something like that. Again, it's not a specific example, it's just generally how that concept works. And yeah, it is. I don't want to sound too impressed, but it is impressive. I didn't know that's how that worked. But again, this is in 2013. This is where some of the more um, detailed document reports. I think that's why I may be so impressed, because this is one of the more detailed documents. Because the most of this malware isn't really going to be used now, especially with some of the later ones. You'll see that it gets very, very in depth. Um, but the reason it is called specifically Armageddon is because in these in the operation drives from there were a few Microsoft Word documents that were just left open and saved in the system. So in the text in the Word document and the person who saved it, the name of the person who saved it, um, was Armageddon, which supposedly was also spelt wrong. Um, if you look at the slide, it has two D's, whereas in this Armageddon it had only one D, which is interesting. But that's Operation Armageddon. So Operation Snake took place a year later. Um, Now, I'm going to be honest, it was fairly difficult to find objective look at the situation of this specific operation, um, because there's a lot of operations named Operation Snake. It sounds cool, which is why a lot of people end up putting it into as an operation name. So it was fairly difficult to find information specifically on this one. But I could find a fairly detailed report by a cybersecurity company who looked into the malware, the rootkit specifically, on um, it was used in this supposed operation. I'm going to butcher the name, Uro, Uroboros rootkit. Just I'm just going to go with that. So it was created in 2011, but it was only discovered in 2014, um, which led investigators believe that at this time that there was a more sophisticated version um, of this rootkit already out there. If it took 3 years to even detect this one, but I mainly left this in to point out the fact that even the ones that I did previously, the January 14th or something like that, that happened recently. The malware that we're seeing on there, we either have not discovered yet, or we will not see for about 3 years. It really puts that idea into perspective that the software techniques of these state-sponsored attacks are going to be so much more sophisticated that they're going to be almost undetectable for a while. It kind of just puts that in perspective because it's a bit more terrifying. Um, but uh, so how does it work? The rootkit basically has two files, a driver file and an encrypted virtual file system file. So again, these are very basic system files um, that or are disguised as system files, along with, I believe, a script that is part of the driver file, if I remember correctly, um, that they run once they're put on a system. Um, Again, investigators don't know how they got it on the system, but just that it's on the system. Um, but once it's on there, it would go into the system file itself, embed itself, extract files from the host, and capture traffic in the network, while at the same time hiding its actions from monitoring software. But since it's comprised of only two system files, each can latch onto the core system files and add modular extensions to fit the environment without detection. Um, at the same time, or at the time of the report, I guess, it really just wasn't determined on how uh, it got there. Um, the avenue of attack was not determined because I haven't found information on there. I don't know. So anybody could have done it. But the name itself, I just thought this was interesting because you're wondering what is Ouroboros. The name derives from the Greek word for an ancient symbol representing a snake. References from this symbol in the snake can be found on all of the file names. Um, so yeah, that was just something that was really interesting. I ended up putting the document itself in the references, so if you want to learn more specifically about it, feel free to go and look at that. So these are one of the larger ones. I think everyone's kind of heard these, whereas the other ones may have just gone under the radar in the public. So the first Ukrainian power grid hack took place on December 23rd, 2015, where a cyber attack caused power outages, which lasted up to 6 hours. Um, During the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the Russian APT sandworm infiltrated multiple power and energy companies and proceeded to cut the power to consumers. Um, this is the beginning of sandworm. Um, in these next slides, you're going to see a lot of sandworm. Um, they're going to be a very recurring theme, and especially attacking these power grids. Um, but so this this APT ended up infiltrating the companies using Black Energy 3, which is an HTTP based kit that spawns bots to flood a network using a DDoS attack, basically. But again, you'll notice Black Energy 3, now not 1 or 2. Well, 1 or 2 are just a basic version of 3, should be understandable, but version 3 uses a plugin that allows variability in the text. So it uses Same way as the other ones, it's very modular. It allows plugins. So once it's on a system, it scans the system, determines where can I attack, and then it says, okay, well, they don't have this, so I should download um, parts or I should download a script or something like that that I can go and attack this. I should download a payload so I can go attack this. Um, I don't necessarily know in cybersecurity how popular that kind of idea is. I'm assuming it is, but based on all these attacks being modular, but it seems to work. So, but once infiltrated, the attackers ended up gaining control of the industrial automation software and then ended up shutting down the power substations, which I don't know if anyone's used like programmable logic controllers for automation, but they are very easy to break, which is very understandable on how you can gain control of an entire factory. I mean, I took a class here at Michigan Tech on it, and the I think like the first like 2 weeks we kept getting it nailed into our head that the actions that we do when we're making this software for industrial automation is that let's say if you're wrong and you misconfigure a sensor, a tube can overheat, which causes a pump to explode, not only causing the company like a few $1 million, but if it explodes, it could have a chain reaction through the facility. It could kill workers on the site, tons of a bunch of stuff like that. So if they're gaining control of this, it has larger implications to other just industrial sites. But I just thought I should mention that. But I'll get back on track. So then they disabled key IT systems by disabling emergency power supplies on IT infrastructure and then the routers and modems, so that when they took the power of the plant itself, it would stop the backup from starting back up. Um, so once they once they disabled that, then they deleted all files throughout the network using this new malware, KillDisk. Um, so the malware is used specifically to wipe, encrypt, and permanently destroy data on hard drives. It's been used in other malware before, um, but it is a newer version at the time. Um, so once the data is gone, the attackers will follow up with a DOS attack on the power company's call centers to delay the communications between the consumers and the company, which would not only make the whole thing more confusing, but would delay the repair time for the company itself. So around 250,000 people were affected by these power outages. Um, but again, it was eventually put back 6 hours later. Other companies were also attacked. Other power companies, but they weren't as severe as this. So I think this is one of the scarier ones. Not the scariest. That's the following one. Not to give too much spoilers, but um, it's one of the scarier ones. Not in destructive capability, but in potential destructive capability. So unlike the previous attacks on the power grids in Ukraine, this one was specifically targeted towards power transmission instead of power, um, well, like a power plant. This was specifically a transmission facility. So due to the low impact of a transmission station going dark, the power was restored an hour later. I think it was like technically like an hour and 4 minutes or an hour and 6 minutes. Um, but it is believed to be the same group that attacked the power grid the year earlier. So we're looking at Sandworm again. So the attack itself was believed by intelligence agencies to be purely a test rather than a destructive attack. So this was purely just a testing ground. So the attackers used a new malware framework called Indestroyer, which I love the name. It was named by I think like Czech cybersecurity agents. Um, Great name. What does it destroy? Industrial systems. Call it in destroyer. Um, it's used specifically to disable power grids. It appears to be an adaptation of the malware used in the previous attack, which is Black Energy 3. Similar to Black Energy 3, it is modular, consisting of now 5 major components, as opposed to just plugins like before. So the 5 components specifically are the backdoor, um, which I think everyone kind of knows, but it's used to control all the uh, other components, and it connects to the command server to receive commands. Um, but this one, it has a second backdoor and gives the attackers access to the victim's network if the main backdoor is compromised. This is what kind of had a little bit of delay, which you'll find later on. And then it has the launcher, which launches the payload, in the and the data wiper itself. You have the payload, which is, you know, network mapping, commands, scripts, and stuff like that. And then finally, you have the data wiping or the data wiper, where it erases registry keys and overwrites necessary system files to not allow systems to boot up again, which makes recovery a much harder process. So in our final cyber attack, um, which I personally believe to be the most destructive and terrifying one, um, of all of these, which I mean, we really can't compare to the recent ones at the beginning of this presentation because again, we don't know. But of all the ones here, I think that this is the most destructive and terrifying. Um, so on June 27th, 2017, a cyber attack on Ukrainian banks, newspapers, and electricity companies took place with a ransomware slash malware, which I'll get to that, called NotPetya. So cybersecurity experts suggested that the attack pretended to be ransomware to buy time to cause the most damage. Now, the idea with that is if you are trying to get into the system or if you are debating a ransom, then or trying to isolate that one specific computer that has the ransom, it allows the malware to spread to other hosts. That's what it specifically means by buying more time. Because I mean, the Ukrainian government, if you're already in the system, for example, like you're already in these banks or electricity companies, most of these people aren't really going to be taking ransom. Most, not all, but most aren't, because this is like a national security issue at this point. Um, so really, it's just used to propagate through the entire or the entire country's network. Um, but it began as an update on the software Medoc. Now, Medoc is a Ukrainian accounting software specifically for government taxes. It's mostly found on businesses. Um, some not Ukrainian, if I remember correctly. I think there was like a few German computers that were attacked that did business with Ukraine, so used Medoc. Um, so the software was installed in around 1 million hosts in the country at the time of the attack. Um, but they had, auto update, which I think most companies end up having or having. Um, so when the auto update was done, it ended up having malware in the auto update, which happened a few weeks earlier. That part is not fully known, how they got into it, but people ended up getting into MEDOC headquarters, they believe, through just a few individuals who had this malware already on their uh, their personal devices and stuff like that. So it's not fully believed or understood at the time of this investigation, um, how that happened. Um, but the attack came from MEDOC. indirectly, Medoc, the company who did the software, did not do this on purpose, but it came from them. Uh, so at this time, a few months earlier, it was parallel to WannaCry, what ransomware attack. Um, but this version of Petya, which is similar to WannaCry, um, used a modified version, which is not Petya. Um, it used a specific exploit that was developed years ago, but was not was recently discovered but not fixed. So WannaCry exploited people who did not update their computers. Same thing with this attack. They found that these companies did not update to the latest version of Windows, which is what this Eternal Blue exploit was. Now, Eternal Blue was a NSA developed exploit of Microsoft Windows. They had this exploit for years, but with the version of Windows and in conjunction with Windows, they fixed the exploit in the newer version of Windows, whatever that was in 2017. And well, not all computers updated to that. So once it got leaked that Eternal Blue exploit was out there, people like WannaCry and Petya took advantage and started doing ransomware attacks on non-updated Windows systems. Um, so together with this modified version of Petya, it encrypts the master file table of the device's storage, irreversibly edits and rewrites the files so that it cannot be fixed through decryption and then begins an automatic restart. So on the original version of Petya, the system would boot and demand payment for the information. That's part of ransomware. But this version would use Windows SMB. So this is a continuation of the last one. So the SMB protocol was used to spread the ransomware to any host in that network. Um, so if any hosts were on the network with an infected computer, the ransomware would intercept passwords traveling through the network. So if I'm trying to get on and stop the spread, and I log on to my computer remotely, then I just set my password to that computer. Well, the infected computer would detect anything traveling in the entire network or subnet that it's in. Don't know how that works, but apparently that's how that works with this malware slash ransomware. Um, so if it would allow privilege escalation through this entire organization, um, which is believed on how they got through MyDoc as well. So this version has been um, different specifically from WannaCry because on this one, not Petya, does not have a kill switch. So this also reinforces the notion from investigators that the attackers took an opportunity to cause damage rather than long-term intelligence gathering, like some of the other attacks were, or the malware found on systems. So the more dangerous part of this attack was that the Ukrainian nuclear power plant in Chernobyl went offline. Um, so that one's kind of bad. If you don't cool those rods, that's how you get nuclear meltdown. Um, some of the lighter ones were the banks and the airports and railways and metro systems, but I guess it's not as important as the nuclear power plant having a meltdown. Um, so good news was that the spread was contained by the next day, which is when the investigation began. Uh, while the investigators were looking through the computers that were attacked once they contained the malware, they found a back door, and they found it in the MEDOC headquarters. So Ukrainian intelligence and government agents raided the MEDOC headquarters, which caused a little bit of a kerfuffle, to shut down their servers because they're like, hey, we didn't do this, we don't have access to this. And the government just went in and shut down the servers anyways. That's the point of a raid. Um, the company was not involved in the attack. They were used as a proxy for the attack. It wasn't intentional. um, but this is what I kind of believe half and half why it's malware and ransomware. Because yes, it was used specifically to cause damage. But the people who did this ended up getting $10,000 in Bitcoin from smaller businesses. So it is kind of ransomware. Um, the investigators ended up finding out that the same tags, I believe it's called, was found on Petya and not Petya, which means that the same people who made Petya made not Petya. Which then further investigation ended up determining, after tracing the communication of this group, who ended up taking $10,000 in Bitcoin, ended up purchasing space on the Tor network. Um, they found out who the group was. It was Sandworm again. This is what I said. It's going to be a theme throughout this. Yeah, Sandworm did it. So that's who did it. Um, yeah. So let's move on to references. So these are my references. Um, you can again see the fourth one down. That's that document. You're going to see a lot of Wikipedia. I'm not a fan of it either, but especially with some of these, that's all I had. I'm not a government agent. I don't have access to this. And sadly, I don't like using Wikipedia as a source, but if that's the only source, I kind of have to use it. So thank you for tuning in to my 51-minute presentation. If you're this far, I feel bad for you. Good luck and have a good one.